So we're in a series called Jesus is Greater. And if you're new, we're going through the book of Hebrews. That's what we generally do as a church. Sometimes we'll do a topical sermon here and there. But the book of Hebrews is a wonderful book. It's written to Jewish believers, Christians, who have had a really hard time. And many of them have grown cold and fallen away. They've stopped fellowshipping together. And the preacher, really, of Hebrews is encouraging them. And we finally get to chapter 11, which is commonly known as the Heroes of Faith. And it's a chapter about faith and about men and women who lived a life of faith. And so today we're going to look at what is faith, how do I grow in my faith, and what does living by faith actually look like day to day. So let's read our text. It's Hebrews 11, verses 1 through 16. If you don't have a Bible or a phone, it'll be on the screen. Starting in verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous. God commended him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. And by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. But he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of the heavens and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Has anyone got a Kleenex for me? I have this heart condition that causes my eyes and my nose to run. Thank you. It's getting worse as I get older. I'm not as old as Tom. What is faith? Well, let's talk about what faith is not. Firstly, I don't think the preacher here is talking about faith as a noun. What I mean by that is when we say, well, he's of the Muslim faith, or I think he's a Christian, or he's Hindu. That's not how he's speaking about faith. I don't think he's speaking about what some people think to be blind faith. This is just where you don't want to think. You just want to do, you just want to go. And so it's this idea of blind faith. I don't think that's what he's talking about. Then I think there are some who may think that faith is sort of an internal energy that I work up. And it's like this fervor for God. And when I get really excited and the worship is wonderful like it was this morning, and then I get psyched up and then I have faith. Well, that third one is kind of the thought I had growing up. You see, in this text, verse 1 gives us the definition of faith. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. I grew up listening to the King James Bible. Now, that's the big one, hardcover, weighs about 100 pounds. And no offense to anyone who loves the King James, it's actually beautiful. But the King James says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Not the assurance and conviction, but the substance. And the way I was taught faith in the 70s was the classic sort of the faith movement, maybe the prosperity gospel, where faith is a substance. And so the thought was it was like a currency that you gathered, and then if you had enough, you could get from God what you wanted. And especially when you added verse 6. So without faith, it's impossible to please God. So without enough money, you're not going to please the guy whose car you want to buy, right? Or whatever. You need the cash. So the way I would read from a child was like Sarah wanted a baby, and so she rounded up enough substance, faith substance, and currency, and she got her kid. And then Noah wanted a bigger boat. He wanted to take his friends and his neighbors out on the water. He wanted to take their pets with him as well. And he got the biggest boat in town, And so that's how faith works, right? Well, I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is in verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not receiving the things promised. So they didn't have the goodies, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles in the land. So it was a faith that was looking way ahead of a boat, a baby, a whatever. It was looking ahead. Now, what is faith? If that isn't faith, what is faith? Well, the first thing I think we need to notice is faith is connected to endurance. The reason why I say that is just before chapter 11 starts, the end of chapter 10, we see the preacher saying this. He says to his Jewish Christian audience, "But recall the former days, after you were enlightened, you endured hardship, hard struggles and sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one." So these people had really been through a hard time. And then he says this, "Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of endurance." And then he starts talking about faith. So the context of chapter 11 is this idea of you need endurance. You've had a hard race and you've given up, you've quit, or you've just kind of shut down. I think the second thing that we need to notice about faith, real faith, is it's connected to hope. Verse 1 says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. Now, when you and I use the word hope, we use it more in the sense of a whimsical wish. Oh, I hope my team wins. Or I really hope the week after next the weather's good because I'm going on vacation. That's how we use hope. Well, let's look at how the preacher uses hope. In Hebrews 6, verse 18 and 19, he says this, so that by two unchangeable things, and let me just let you in on them, the two things he's talking about is God's promises and when God makes an oath. So he says, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain. He says, this hope is an anchor in the soul which has its place, it enters into the inner place behind the curtain. Now, what's this curtain? What's he talking? So the Jewish audience goes, ah. But we go, curtain, help me out here. Well, their place of worship in the Old Testament was first the tabernacle of Moses and then the tabernacle of Solomon. And there was a place in the temple or the tabernacle where there was a curtain and a special room, and it was called the holiest of holies. And that's where the presence of God was. And if any of you have ever seen Indiana Jones with the Ark of the Covenant, and so a priest was allowed to go in behind the curtain once a year to make atonement for the nation. Only once. And that's what was so shocking when Jesus died, and that curtain in the temple was ripped from top to bottom. It was like a few inches thick, and it was ripped, and the priests and the people in the temple at that time looked into the very holiest of holies, and they were like, we didn't die, because the new covenant kicked in, where we now become the temple of God as believers, and we have the presence of God in us. And so he says hope is this anchor. It's an anchor for the soul, and it's anchored behind the curtain. So what I imagine, and I don't know much about boats, the only thing I know about boats is they float and they're very expensive. But I imagine this: faith is a rope that tethers me to the anchor of hope, which is embedded in the very character of God, who He is, the one who cannot lie. And I'm anchored. And the water may be murky, and I can't see. Sometimes I can't see the anchor. I don't know what. There's just a little rope that kind of goes into the water. But man, it's just anchored. It's immovable. That's the context in which he uses the word hope. And this idea of being into and stuck in God is common throughout the scriptures. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Well, in the original Greek, it goes something like this: for God loved the world in this way. You see, when we say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, the image I have is, well, God loved me so much, he even threw in his Son. It's like, yeah, take it all. But the original writers were, God loved the world so much. This is how he loved the world. He gave his son. It wasn't a case of quantity. It was a focus on quality. And then he says this, I gave my son that whosoever believes into him should not perish. But that doesn't make English sense. So we just say in. The problem is we believe in a lot of stuff. I believe in thin crust pizza. If I eat it, I won't put on weight. Well, this reminds me of in 1859, Charles Blondin pushed a wheelbarrow on a tightrope across the Niagara Falls. When he got to the other side, he said to the people, who of you believe I can put a man in the wheelbarrow and push it back? They said, we believe. He said, can I have a volunteer? This literally happened. No one on that day believed into the wheelbarrow. They just believed. And this is the kind of belief that faith is. It's a believing into. So faith is this relational heart rope, this assurance and conviction that tethers me to an anchor called hope that's embedded in the immovable, unchangeable God, the very nature and character of God. That's what faith is. So how do we develop a life of faith that endures? Well, the whole of chapter 11 tells us about a bunch of people. We're going to look at 5 in our text. But just before we do, how do I live by faith? Well, the next chapter, Hebrews 12, verse 1 tells us, look at what he says. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, it's the guys we've been reading about and the girls we've been reading about. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. How? Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Look at that picture. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary and faint-hearted. This is how we grow in faith. Firstly, he tells us to lay aside every weight and sin. He's not saying the same thing twice. I think there's a difference there. We know what sin is. The way we lay it aside is by coming to Jesus, repenting, confessing our sin, and we do that regularly. It's a lifestyle. Just like fish swim, Christians repent. But then he talks about laying aside every weight. These are things that aren't necessarily sins. They're just unhelpful. And I, through the years, have learned some things are not helpful. When I'm running, I don't need to be carrying that. For example, one of the things I don't have are the codes to the online movies. It's not helpful for me. When I watch movies, I watch with my family. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm a spiritual giant. I'm saying it because I'm weak. I can't carry extra weight and chase Jesus the way I want to. I can't. I need to be as light and as nimble as possible because I want to be right there with him, right? And it's not bondage to me. You may look at me and go, that's bondage. No, it's freedom. Woo! It's wonderful. And so my dad's dream for me was to be a distance runner. My dream was soccer. But he would tell me, boy, when you run, you look at the man's feet in front of you. You don't look back, you'll fall. You don't look around, you look right there, and it'll draw you, and it'll help you, it'll pace you, right? And he says, look to Jesus. every weight, every sin. Look to Jesus, run. That's where you're focusing every day. You let him draw you. You run. And then he talks about this great cloud of witnesses that are egging you on. And I don't know about you, but if any of you did any youth sports or whatever, you know, man, when there's an uncle or an auntie or a dad or someone you know or a girl that you know you think is your girlfriend, but she doesn't know anything about it yet, and they're going, go boy, go girl, your legs, man, you just get that superhuman strength, you know what I mean? And this is the picture he's drawing of us running. Look to Jesus. And we're not to run alone. There's a great cloud of witnesses. We run together. There's an ultra marathon in South Africa called the Comrades. And some of the best runners in the world take about 6 hours to run this race. 5 to 6 hours. And they cut it off at 12 hours. If you don't make it, you don't get to finish. You're out. And I've had friends run it. I've never run it. I'm not crazy. And I told you I like soccer. And so my friends have told me that even though you train on your own, when the day comes, there are groups of runners, and they call them a bus. And you can be in the 7-hour bus or the 8-hour bus or the 9-hour. And those are the guys who are wanting to do the race in 7 hours or 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 or 12. And you run with 200-300 guys. And you're in the 8-hour bus. And man, it's almost impossible to do it at the time you want without running in a bus. You need to run, and I need to run in a bus. There's a great cloud of witnesses, right? But let's have a look quickly at now these 5 people, and then we'll land the ship. Abel is the first one he mentioned. For those of you who don't know, Abel was the second child of Adam and Eve. Their first, after coming out of the garden, the fall, they had Cain and Abel. And it says here, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous. God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. Genesis 4 tells us the story. And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. But Cain, his brother, brought fruit and vegetables. Now, when Eve and Adam sinned, an animal died to cover their nakedness and blood was shed. A precedent was set for the cost of sin. Abel, in obedience, comes along and kills his best little lamb or whatever, it doesn't tell us. Blood is shed for sin. God accepts the sacrifice because it points to something. It ultimately points to Jesus. What does Cain do? Cain conveniently picks some fruit and vegetables. And so Cain gets jealous and he kills his brother. Abel brought a better offering that pointed to Jesus, and it cost him his life. Hebrews 11 says Abel lived by faith. What was it? That he died young? Many of us know people who shouldn't have died young, or they died younger than they could have, and they were amazing people, and they were serving God, and they were pouring their lives out for others, and their lives were taken like this. Abel is that guy. He shouldn't have died young. The Bible says he's a faith hero, because his sacrifice pointed to somebody who brought the ultimate sacrifice, who was the ultimate sacrifice. And so our suffering, when done in faith, is a beautiful thing. Enoch's the next guy. Verse 5 of chapter 11, by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Genesis 5:23 tells us, thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. This guy lived a long life, walking every day intimately with God, and God took him. Now, there's not many people like that in the Bible, right? And I was struck by the fact that there are 365 days in our calendar. And to me, it just spoke of day by day, walking the long road of obedience, fellowship with God. God calls it faith. Look at the contrast of the two lives. One dies young, one doesn't die. Your faithfulness, day by day, walking with Jesus, exercising spiritual disciplines, faithfully, prayer closet every day, is a walk of faith that points to some. Look at Enoch, Jude 14, in the book of Jude 14, New Testament book. Watch how Enoch points to Jesus. It was also about these that Enoch, the seventh of Adam, prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way. Enoch points to eternity in his devotion to God. He points to a hope beyond death. And he points to the one who ultimately would conquer death, who would rise again and never die. Never die. Can you see how Abel and Enoch point to Jesus in completely different ways, but they're brothers and they're called men who walk by faith? Let's have a look at Noah. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that was to come. Now, those of us who don't know the story well, do you know it took Noah 120 years to build that ark? Now, some people think it had never rained up until Noah, because in the earlier chapters of Genesis, it tells us that it hadn't rained yet, but that dew would cover the earth and water it. But even if it had rained, they certainly didn't have a flood big enough to lift this boat, which was the size of a small battleship. That took 120 years, and they mocked him, and they scoffed at him. And look at what it says in Luke 17:24, how Noah pointed to Christ. For as the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to another, can you imagine the day of Noah when it finally started raining? So will the Son of Man be in his day. But first he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so it shall be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. Noah pointed to Jesus, the ultimate ark that would save us from the coming judgment and death. Jesus preached about Noah and said, he's the sign that you can see about me. Finishing with Abraham and Sarah. We know the story. Abraham was 75 years old when he got the promise. He was 100 when Isaac, their first, the child of promise, came. Sarah was 90 years old. How did Abraham point to Jesus? What was the connection? Once again, Jesus preaching in John 8:56. He says this, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And they picked up stones and got ready to kill him. You see, on that day when God said to Abraham, I want you to take your son Isaac, and I want you to go up a mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him. I can imagine what was going through Abraham's head. I don't know this God. He's never required anyone to sacrifice their son. It's a sin to do that. And in obedience, he put the wood on his son's back, and they began to climb that mountain. And on the way up, the young man, some say he was a teenager, said, Dad, I don't understand it. We've got the wood, we've got the fire. Where's the offering? Abraham goes, God will provide. I can imagine his heart breaking. They build the altar together on the top of that mountain, lay the wood out. I don't know how it happened. I don't know if Abraham had to grab Isaac's hand and tether it to himself. I don't know what happened, but Isaac ends up on that altar, tied down. And Abraham lifts the knife. It's time to kill. He's delayed it for as long as he can. And as he's about to plunge that knife into that boy that he's waited 100 years for, a voice comes out of heaven and says, stop, there's an offering. An animal caught in the bush. I want to tell you, I believe, according to John 8, Abraham saw Jesus' day. One day, the Son of God would climb a hill with wood on his back, knowing that he was the sacrifice. He laid down. The nails were placed in his palms or in his wrists, and no one shouted, stop. And he took the nails for us. The perfect sacrifice. I want to tell you, if you're here today and you're a believer, what does it look like being tethered to Jesus? How does it affect your life? Are you suffering like Abel? God's called you to suffer well. Don't waste your suffering on self-pity. Let it point to Jesus, who's the perfect sacrifice. Maybe like Enoch, you just live one day faithfully, faithfully, faithfully. No one really sees what you're doing, but you live faithfully every day of your life. You're living a life of faith that points to Jesus, the one who is eternal and the one who will balance the books at the end of time. Maybe you are Noah and you work and you're not appreciated, and you're beginning to wonder if your work is even worth it. I want to tell you, you point to the one who has done the heavy lifting and the work for us, the one who has done the work of salvation for us. And maybe you're like Abraham and Sarah, called to obedience. Your life points to Jesus, and you're living by faith. If you're checking out Christianity today, we're going to be